talks on the subject of how not to fall out over views. So last week, this whole theme was introduced by Articity to us, and it was introduced in a kind of sequential pattern of movement along the spiritual path towards enlightenment, towards where the Buddha reached, towards the state of mind that the Buddha enjoyed, state of mind known as enlightenment. And in a way, the sort of pathway that we're going to be following through that is to start from an exploration of wrong view, through an exploration of right view, and then looking at what it might be like to have no view. So the Buddha said to have no views at all. So I hope that during this, you start to get a sense of what that's pointing at, because this series is really quite subtle. Well, it's very subtle, actually. We're looking at really very subtle effects on our minds. And this evening, we're going to be starting off at the beginning of that pathway. We're going to be looking at wrong view. So the title this evening is, Are All Views Equally True? So I'm going to leave an answer to that to the end. I could even just leave it. You could sort it out for yourself, come to your own conclusion as to whether they're all equally true or not. But we're going to be primarily looking at, as it were, the problem of views. We're going to be looking at wrong views. So one of the things that Articity drew out last week, and I think is definitely worth reiterating, is a kind of, there's a sort of fundamental problem with the use of our English language. So the word view here is very widely used in our language and can quite easily be synonymous with an opinion and can be synonymous with a thought. But that's not really what we're looking at. In a way, our views are deeper. They're underneath our opinions and they're kind of underneath our thoughts. I was thinking, it's hard to think of a direct synonym other than view that kind of points to where we're going. But I thought the word belief was a bit better. Belief doesn't seem to exist in our heads. We spend a lot of time in our heads. Thoughts, opinions, whatever seem to exist in our heads. Views are a bit deeper, a bit like a sense of a belief. Seems to come from a slightly deeper place. And that's kind of where views come from. But then belief has its own kind of connotations, but it tends to have a slightly religious connotation, or belief in the power of something. So it's not quite that either. It's something like the belief underpinning the opinion. That's kind of the territory that we're looking at from the Buddhist perspective. So we can see already that this can be quite hard to grasp. It can be quite slippery to really get to what we're going to be talking about. But it does cause us an awful lot of problems. So it's worth making some effort to kind of try and get there as best we can. So, having said all that, so I'm going to be looking at a few things, sort of defining what views is. Where appropriate, I'm trying to illustrate that with concrete examples. Otherwise, it's easy in talks about views to become a little bit intellectual, a little bit abstract, a little bit academic. Now, many people like that, but it's not necessarily helpful. It's an approach that tends to keep us in our heads, keep us above our necks. With Buddhism, as much as possible, we like to be operating from the neck down, really in the depths of our body, in the depths of our feelings, in the depths of our emotions. That's really where we want to be more operating. important. So there'll be some kind of slightly more academic ways of just trying to explain the territory that I'm talking about. But where possible, I'll try to bring in some concrete examples, sometimes they're easier, just to get a sense of where we're at. And around about halfway through, I'm going to have a break and ask you just to break up into little groups, just to talk about what I've said and to bring your own ideas. What I was saying will be sparking off lots of ideas in you, and just to share them in a smaller group for 10 or 15 minutes. And then in the second half, we'll move on to slightly different kind of aspect of wrong view. The second half is more about how we can sort of identify them, sort of tools for identifying them and what we might be able to do to help identify them further and more deeply. But we'll get started with just looking at what a wrong view is. So last week, Artisity explained a wrong view quite accurately, quite vividly, as being the lens through which we interpret our experience. So we're in the territory of experience, which is the input of our five senses into our minds up here, that are completely isolated from the outside world. So everything out here that we are all seeing is an interpretation made in here by what's going on through our five senses. So that then all gets muddled up into our conditions, our backgrounds, our habits, our views, and that conditions and makes the experience that we live with, that we experience. So all of these things get kind of muddled up in together. And views are a very important component of that, as it were, meshing together of everything to make an experience. We don't just see a door as a door. We see a door as a separator between this room and outside. We see it as a doorway to something else. We have all these things that we add on to the simple, straightforward sense experience of seeing a door or a colour or a window. So all of that's the kind of territory that we're looking at. And in there are views. So views colour our experience, like a tea bag colours water. It colours our experience. And it can be the lens through which we examine our experience. It's the lens through which we interpret new experiences. They've also been described as the charged interpretation of our experience. So experience is an interpretation. It's an interpretation of the input of five senses, muddled up with our history and previous experiences and what we've learned. So what we've learned as children, as before, we can apply to try to interpret and make sense of new experiences as they present ourselves to us. So that's kind of how views, as it were, operate within us and how they influence our overall experience of the world. But what defines it, as it were, as being wrong? So the Buddha would say that a wrong view is an interpretation of our experience which is not in accordance with reality. Now that's quite a big statement, and I'm not sure it necessarily means that much. So I need to kind of unpack that a little bit to see what that might mean. So reality from a Buddhist perspective is nothing but an ever-changing set of conditions in which we exist, in which we operate, and within which we have agency. So we are a condition that has agency on conditions around us, and that then conditions the reality that we exist in. And so things go on and on and on. So things constantly arise, things constantly pass away, and we respond to things arising, we respond to things passing away. That's just the way life is, and we navigate our way through time, through life, like a boat through water and different weather conditions. And we have to modify and change as conditions determine in order to try and reach a destination. So from the perspective here, we're trying to improve our lives spiritually. We're trying to move towards a goal, enlightenment. We're trying to move in a certain direction. So we have an intention, we have a kind of rudder, and we navigate using various tools through a reality which we have some control over, but not total. So we just have to kind of respond to reality as it presents itself to us. So in a way, that's what reality is from this point of view of Buddhism. And a wrong view is to interpret aspects of that experience incorrectly, to not see things like that, to not see things as they really are. And the way that we do that, how we tend to do that, is that we don't tend to take into account all of the conditions of reality. Now, we're not always entirely sure of all of those conditions. But there are generally a lot more conditions at play than we are aware of, but we are choosing not to take into account. And what we tend to do is we tend to stick with the pleasurable aspects of our reality, of our experience, that suit us. So we tend then to experience a one-sided view of a kind of a situation of our experience. Our experience consists of the bits that please us, and we tend to dismiss or forget about those bits that don't. And what we can find is that with this grasping onto the sort of pleasurable experiences of the world around us, it can give us a kind of sense of control. So we can feel, because it feels quite nice and right, we can feel that we have an element of control of our experience that in fact we don't really have. And unfortunately, this sense of control can lead us to act in the same way as we did before. So it kind of reinforces what we do to give us the pleasure, to give us the sense of control. And that builds up a habit. And actions have karmic consequences, as we have discussed here in other series. Actions have karmic consequences. And the more that we repeat actions, the more we embed ourselves in a kind of cycle of suffering. And the more that we embed ourselves in a cycle of reactivity, and the more that we sort of stifle our creativity. So we have a teaching on a reactive and a creative mind. A reactive mind is the one that just constantly reacts in the same habitual fashion. A creative mind is one that looks at the panoply of circumstances and conditions around us and makes creative choices. Makes creative choices to maybe not do something this time that we did last time. And these can be challenging for us, A, to see, and B, to do. But in a way, that's what we're looking at with all the views. In the first instance, we have to see them, and then we have to challenge them, and only then can we break them and move into more of a sense of liberation. So there's a couple of examples I thought of just to try and sort of illustrate some of those points. So from my own experience, this was something we talked about last week. I remember always thinking when I was younger, always thinking of myself as an extrovert. I'd sort of surveyed, friends and the world around me and people, and thought being extrovert was better than being introvert. So I identified myself as an extrovert. So in a way, there was a sort of sense of pleasure in that. There was a sense of positive choice that suited me. It wasn't pleasure, it was really, happy, happy, happy. But there was something suited me in that. So when I say pleasure about experience, there's just something that suits you. So it suited me to have this view that I was an extrovert. And so I thought that was the way I was. But I was on a training program with work. And part of that was to do this thing called Myers-Briggs. It's quite famous, many of you may have come across it. You fill out a questionnaire and then there's some clever algorithm that works out what your personality type is. So I filled out this Myers-Briggs personality type. I don't know, it comes out with all sorts of letters, can't remember them. But anyway, I was quite strongly introvert. So I had this view of myself which pleased me, which I carried along for many years. Tried to act on the fact that I was an extrovert. And then, lo and behold, quite randomly, I found out by this, kind of analysis, which I didn't doubt was in its own way accurate, that I was introvert. And I find that quite discombobulating. I found that quite sort of shocking, because somebody told me something about me that I thought I knew and that they should have been wrong, but they weren't wrong. They had undermined and they pointed out, as it were, a wrong view. So I'd made an entire construct of myself that turned out to be wrong. But actually, I find that quite hard to hear and to live with and to sort of think, well, what does that mean? It has actually been really useful. I'm perfectly happy being an introvert. And it explains much better a lot of things about myself and my behaviour fit much more in place than they do or would do if I still thought I was an extrovert. So I like things that introverts like. I like things quiet. I like being by myself. I like lots of introverted things. I find a lot of extroverted things quite challenging and quite difficult. I find getting this talk quite difficult. You might find it quite difficult to listen to. So in fact, that was particularly useful to me, and it did start to make sense of my experience. So that's one example of where wrong views can really derail us. It really causes an ongoing suffering for a long, long time. There's another one I thought about. There's one we talked about actually at our team meetings before, but I've forgotten what it was. It was quite a good one, but I've forgotten. Better, I've got one here. There's another thing I was thinking of in terms of a kind of sequential. So up until quite recently, I was getting quite annoyed with the Drosophila in the countertop compost bins that we all have because we're good citizens. And we put all our peelings and tea bags and whatever, and we put them in the compost and we solved the world's problem. But I was getting really annoyed with it because I got these little flies when it's hot. And I didn't like having all these flies around in the kitchen. So I was tempted, I didn't, but I was tempted to think, well, what difference would it make if I just put them in the ordinary bin? If I just got rid of that bin, and I took everything away and it was tidier and there were fewer flies. And then I was thinking, well, often we do these sorts of things. There's something that just kind of annoys us, or something that just kind of tempts us. And we think, well, what's the harm? What difference will it make? Let me sort of slip some orange peels into the other things. And then I thought, well, the problem with it, excuse me, the problem with it is that could set up So there might be very few karmic consequences of that we particularly notice. You know, we got hit by a brick walking down the street or whatever. So there may be a lot of karmic consequences you don't see in that. But it sets up a pattern. It sets up a minor habit. So then we think, I've not got much space in this kitchen. I've got to have 2 other bins, one blue and one black. What if I just forgot about everything and I just put everything in the black? What harm would that do? I got away with the flies and all and the tea bags. Now all I need to do is put all the blue then into the black. And I've got all this extra space. And then you could think, well, you could do that, and then nothing much particularly happens. But then you might end up feeling embarrassed because you have to put your blue and your green bin out, or you never put yours out because they're not never got anything in there. Then you're embarrassed about your neighbours seeing that you never put those bins out, and you're not a recycler. So from a very simple start of just doing something that suits you, you can set up a trend, and you can set up a sense of, I think I got away with it, which can lead to other actions, which can lead to other actions, which can lead to suffering, because you then got to try and live with your neighbours and them all knowing that you don't do any recycling. So it can be a kind of a cascade, these wrong views. They can sort of set up cascades. And we can end up getting ourselves into far deeper water than we started. So through firmly held views, we have a tendency not to see, or a tendency to choose not to see our experience in its entirety. So we don't see things in their wholeness. We don't see the good and the bad and the neutral and hold them all equally and then make some sort of informed choice. We tend to just grab the bits that we like and sort of slip the other bits under the carpet. And that's what gets us into muddles. So we focus on an interpretation, as it were. We don't focus on the whole story. We focus on an interpretation of the story. And our interpretation of the story is very often incorrect. It's not accurate. So all of this is all kind of well and good. But it does beg the question, why do we do that? Why on earth do we do that? Excuse me. So one of the reasons that we do this really is that it's a kind of defense mechanism. And what we're defending is the ultimate in the wrong view from the Buddhist perspective, which is that we have a fixed identity which is unchanging. We have an ego. So we have this fixed, unchanging sense of ourselves known as ego. And at all times, ego has to be protected. So it's a fundamental wrong view. Now, this is not a view that we're going to be able to correct overnight. This is a very fundamental wrong view. But it's good to even just have it as a thought experiment. Just be open to the idea that this is true, that there is a fundamental wrong view of a fixed and unchanging self. From this wrong view, in a way, flows the vast majority of all of our other wrong views. They're all about protecting the sense of ego. So another fundamental wrong view flowing from this, a level or two up, if you like, from the very bottom, is conceit. So conceit in English means being a little bit self-important, a slight edge of arrogance. Conceit in Buddhism does not mean that. Conceit in Buddhism means this constant evaluation of ourselves as being equal to, better than, or worse than everybody else around us. So being, do the other way around, better than, equal to, or less than everybody else that we know. Now, I quite like reflecting on conceit. It's not something that we talk about before. I find, and have found, and continue to find, I fall into that wrong view very, very often. In all sorts of situations, I kind of measure where I'm at. It's something that we all do. We measure where we're at. Carry on. Yeah, so I find myself all the time sort of evaluating where am I in this sort of structure? Where am I? And we find ourselves in new situations being a bit until we sort out where we are. Once we've sorted out where we are, there can be a sense of relaxation. And that's not helpful. It's something that we can all identify with, but it's quite a fundamental wrong view within Buddhism. It's known as conceit. And in a way, you can see, so we have that sort of root wrong view of a fixed and unchanging self. We can see how that wobbles itself around until we find some sort of equilibrium of where we are in different situations. And from these, you can just see that there are layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of wrong views that develop as we interpret different parts and different experiences, all stemming from that sense of self and sense of identity. Within that, one of the things that I find quite helpful to think of to kind of undermine is that all of these views are there to protect us. Then within that protection system, there's huge amounts of fear. We're absolutely petrified of any of these views being punctured or being shown to be wrong, because that upsets where we think we are in the grand scheme of things in terms of equal to, better than, or less than. And even deeper than that, it can undermine our view of being a fixed and unchanging self. So we're petrified. There are huge amounts of fear that we carry around in us in these layers upon layers upon layers of protection, of root wrong views, and all of the other wrong views that stem from it. If we can puncture them and get underneath them, we liberate ourselves from that fear. And if we can get right underneath that sense of ourselves as a fixed and unchanging self, then there's nothing left to be fearful of. There's nothing left to protect. And all that is left underneath all of that is love. So if we can get through all of those layers of fear and protection, at the very bottom, there's nothing left but love. And love would be an ultimate and right view, which we'll be talking about later. So at this point, so we've gone through an idea of what wrong views is. We've got it to love, it's not the place to stop. So let's break up into groups of 3, 4, whatever kind of naturally, occurs where you're sitting, and just have a chat about, does this make sense? Do you actually believe that your views are holding you back? Or do you think, I don't know about that, I think my views are all perfectly sound and solid, thank you very much. Do we actually believe any of this? And if we do, are there any views that we're aware of ourselves? We did that team meetings where it was amazing what came out, actually, when we just talked about what views we hold. So do we hold any views that we think hold us back in to do with your recycle, to do with that? Completely open to you. So we could do that for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we'll just ring a bell and keep on to the next section. Go back. Good. So we just what I'd like to turn to now for the last 15-20 minutes would just be to kind of look at, what can we do about this? Are we just victims of this, passive, helpless victims? Or is there something that we can actually do? So how can we go about evaluating these views if and when we identify one? Part of the biggest issue with views is identifying it in the first place. It's so insidious, so deep, it acts without any identification. So once we've identified it, what can we do about it? Well, there are various things that we can kind of ask ourselves, various sorts of levels of challenge we can just bring to ourselves just to see what our responses are. So one is, what is the effect of this view? So I identified that I have this view. What is its effect? So does it make you feel good? Does it make you feel righteous? Does it make you feel in control? Now, these are good things to know, but they're not identifying it as being wrong or right. So it's not necessarily a right view that makes you feel good, makes you feel righteous, and makes you feel in control. But it's good to know that they're there, because it could explain why you have that view and why you haven't got rid of that view if it turns out to be the wrong one. Because it's making you feel good, making you feel righteous, making you feel in control in some way, some subtle ways. So you have to be listening to some of the subtler answers to these questions. But then we can challenge slightly further and say, does this view accord with my ethical life? Or does my actions based upon this view accord with my ethical life? Now we're getting a little bit pokier. So does this view make me kinder or more loving? So for those of you that are mitras, and for those of you that are not yet mitras but interested in Buddhism, then there's the 5 positive precepts of Buddhism, which are our guiding rudder through the storms of life, as it were. So the 5 ethical precepts. And the first of those is that we would like to we undertake training, we always start undertake training, with deeds of loving kindness, or just becoming more loving. So does this view help me, make me more interested to do deeds of loving kindness? Does it make me more loving? The second precept is about generosity, with open-handed generosity. Does this view encourage me to be more generous? So the answer to either of those questions can be quite telling about how that view is going to make you act, the consequences of that view, and how the consequences in terms of your action from that view accord with the ethics that if you're a mitra or an order member, you have made a commitment to be as guiding principles in your life. So by these sort of simple questions, we can start to spot, there's a clash. And although that might sound quite simple and obvious, and you think, well, obviously I would have noticed that, Actually, we don't. And very often with views, they can be quite contrary to what we think we're about. So we can act quite unethically, very easily, whilst in our heads, telling ourselves, well, I'm a literal, I'm an order member, I go along to Buddhist centre regularly, I know the precepts, and I have taken these precepts as guiding principles. Quite easily, we can just do one thing and say another, say one thing, do the other. So it's good that once we identify these things to just check them against the ethical precepts that we've taken on board. Another one, which isn't a direct ethic, but it's very telling, is, does this view bring me closer to others? Or does this view push them away? Or do my actions on the basis of this view bring me closer to others or push them away? Again, we can say all the right things about what we think and what we believe, but our actions based on very, very deep-rooted views can tell us quite a different story. So it's good to just sit down and try and be honest with ourselves. Does this view, the actions from this view, make me more friendly, make me more outgoing, bring people to me for friendships, or does it push people away? Or even more subtly, does it bring people to me and make me connect with people who share this view and reject those who don't? Am I sectioning out those people with whom I have an affinity based on this view and rejecting all those who don't share this view? That one can be quite telling. And then it's worth just asking, how are you going about asking and answering those questions to yourself? Is it purely intellectual? Are you just thinking your way through everything? Step by step by step by step. Intellect, logic, da-da-da-da-da-da, mathematical, da-da-da, equation, result. Is it just that? We need to employ that, but is it just that? Or is there a feeling? Is there a feeling in there? Or perhaps even better, you can't tell. You can't tell. There's just a sort of stone in your shoe feeling. There's something not quite right. You can't intellectually work it out. And you don't have a strong feeling, particularly you're aware of, about it either. There's just something not quite right in there, a little stone in the shoe type experience. Often that's where our exploration of views begin. There's just something not quite right. There's something kind of not quite right. There's nothing more that you can say about it than that. That's where the exploration needs to begin. And one of the other things that's very good to ask ourselves is, how ready are you to take in new information that will allow this view to change? So I was convinced that I was an extrovert. I got some information that changed and challenged that view. It took me a bit of time, but I gave that view up. I took that information on board, took it on the chin, you might say, and sort of sat with it and realised various other things accorded with this alternative view, and I took it on board. That's fine. So I changed my view. That's fine. That's what we have to do sometimes. Sometimes we might be quite stubborn. Sometimes we're quite willing to change views. But how willing are you to change view? How much of a fight will you put up for your particular view? In a way, the amount of fight that you are likely to put up is an indicator of how deep that view is being held. So then you might want to think, well, what's underneath that? What am I afraid of if that view is taken away? What's the fear? Underneath all of these views, there's a level of fear. What is the fear? What am I afraid of? Once you identify what you're afraid of, then it all starts to kind of relax. At least it gives you some maneuverability to think, would it be that bad? Gives you some degree of leeway, some relaxation to this rigidity that no, my view is correct, my view is true. Some of your views might be true for now. Some are very likely not to be. So just thinking, just to throw in a last minute twizzle of how complex this can be. So many of you coming along here, coming along to Buddhist Centre, you may have decided at some point in your life to become vegetarian or vegan. That would be a good thing to do. Many you might be, I don't mind whether you are or you're not. But it's not uncommon. Now we can take that view and we can sort of unpack it. So there's various ways to end up being vegetarian or vegan. So the best way to end up being vegetarian or vegan would be to be coming along to the Buddhist Centre, taking on board the first precept, wanting to do more deeds of loving kindness, and becoming a vegetarian or vegan to minimize your harm in the world, and see that as a way that you can easily minimize your harm. So you can examine the various different aspects of farming, the effects on the climate, the effects on the planet, the effects on harm on the animals, etc., etc. You can have quite a wide view of reasons, intellectual reasons behind being a vegetarian or vegan. You can have taken on board the ethical precept of deeds of loving kindness. You could have thought deeply about how that can change and affect your life, how that can become a stronger rudder for you. And you could have come to the conclusion that based on all of that, it would be good for you to be vegetarian or vegan. There are also other people who just like being a bit of a centre of attention. So they go to dinner parties or out to restaurants, they just like being different. So they have to have a different meal when they're there. So everybody notices them. There are just people who are like that. It's based on their views. But there are people who like that, who might decide to be vegetarian or vegan because it draws attention to themselves. They like that. It gives them that little taste of some sort of pleasure out of their experience. So you can see there's an action of being vegetarian or vegan, but there are different ways to get there. So just how somebody is doesn't necessarily give you the whole story. Just because somebody's vegetarian or vegan doesn't let you know that they've thought deeply about harm, that they're following an ethical precept. And this is an important aspect of accordance of deeply held beliefs, views, and a kind of wide survey of their experience, their environment. So you can have the same thing, but you can reach it by different views. And that's another way where we very often completely delude ourselves. That we do actions that are externally seem to be good. We might be doing actions specifically because they're externally seen to be good, but they're not connected to anything deep within us. So there are right action, as it were, in some ways, but coming from a wrong view. So that's the last example that I wanted to kind of bring out. Again, it just exemplifies the subtle, slippery nature of where we're pointing with this series, with an examination of views. So just lastly, just to finish that off, I think views that are based on ethics are more likely to be right views than views that are based on some sort of ego construction, where we're grabbing some sort of vicarious pleasure from the way we are in the world. And how do we train ourselves in being able to do all this? How do we train ourselves in being able to have that awareness to spot these views and tendencies within us? Well, it's quite simple. We start with mindfulness and breathing, which broadens an awareness of ourselves. We overlay that with the metta-bhavana, which allows us and trains us to be more open and loving in the world. And we constantly reflect on the 5 precepts on our ethics. So all the basics that we teach over and over and over again, week in, week out, it just comes back to awareness through the mindfulness breathing, positive emotion, because some of these things can be quite challenging, so we have to have a degree of positive emotion for ourselves, and constant exploration and deeper reflection on ethics and precepts, particularly in their positive formulations. They are pointing us in the direction that we want to be going. So in answer to the question at the very beginning, are all views equally true? I would say probably not. Probably all views are equally wrong.